Welcome to the Scotland's Choice podcast. Let's find out who we've got on the podcast today.
I'm Toni Giugliano, and I'm the policy convener, the policy development convener for the SNP.
And Toni, obviously you've been around in politics for quite a while now. What got you into politics, and how did you become a part of the independence movement? What brought you to that position?
So actually, it was my grandfather that was particularly political and politicised me when I was quite young, and was essentially was an Italian communist, an old school Italian communist. He was, when I was growing up, it was the Berlusconi years. So that got me really interested in what was happening in Italy. And I was following a lot of what was happening there through, Italian TV and reading Italian newspapers and that kind of thing. So that really got me politicized at home. And I guess it wasn't really until I went to university that I joined the European movement there. And I felt at the time that the UK was going in a very Eurosceptic direction. And that was actually during Gordon Brown. So it wasn't even during the Tory years of Brexit. It hadn't even been thought of. I remember writing an article in 2005 suggesting that the UK should have a referendum on, or that the UK would have a referendum on the EU within the next 10 years. And in the end, it did. I kind of felt at the time that Scotland could do better as an independent country in the EU and having its own say. So I guess it was that idea of Scotland in the world stage and Scotland having its own voice in the world stage. That's really what brought it to the SNP.
Well, to that end, Toni, I understand that you've hosted a seminar recently on independence. Could you tell me and the listeners a bit about it and whether or not we can look forward to other such events coming up in the near future?
Sure. So we had our first independence seminar in January with Mike Russell, our party president, and Kirsty Hughes. And it was a great event. It was sold out within 24 hours. I think it shows really the appetite, Drew, amongst our membership on independence issues and having discussions about some of the main issues around independence. I mean, the idea behind these really is to give our activists the tools to equip them to have conversations, of course, on some of the trickier, perhaps, you could call them that, issues. And, the idea is not to shy away from them, but to tackle them head on. So we started with EU membership and EU accession and what that might look like and, how to get from A to B. We're hoping to have our next seminar on the 25th of May with Gordon McIntyre Kemp and Karen Adam as our two, and Alison Thewlis. So we'll have three speakers.
Well, here on Scotland's Choice, you mentioned the EU. We've talked with several guests now about the EU and why it's so important to rejoin. That seems to be a recurring theme with all of the guests that we've had. There's been some really common threads throughout all of the answers that we've had from people, but some interesting points that perhaps always aren't as common. And it's always interesting, I think, to hear different perspectives. So with that in mind, what would you say are the main, the primary, benefits that we stand to gain after rejoining the EU?
Well, we would be part of a market that's 7 times bigger than the UK. So we were dragged out of the EU against our will. We would have a seat at the top tables of Europe. We would be able to represent our national interest in the way that the UK never really did. Even when we were part of the EU, as part of the UK, whether it was fisheries or climate change or any issue really it was the UK that led on, 9 times out of 10. I think, I think one time on fisheries, instead of allowing our own cabinet secretary, they sent an unelected member of the House of Lords to represent the UK at an EU summit. So even when we were part of the EU within the UK, we weren't able to voice our own distinct national interests. So I think that's the main point for me, is that we will be able to shape, um, and influence also the EU agenda overall. I mean, if you look at countries like Ireland or Malta,
Mm.
you know, small member states, but actually historically it's been the smaller member states that have had, some of the best EU presidencies. For example, they were the most effective EU presidencies, putting things high up on the agenda. Ireland really being able to pull its weight around Brexit, and the EU demonstrating that it stands by its member states, in the way that it stood by Ireland throughout the Brexit saga, and it still does, and it will continue to. Um, so really, for me, it's about, it's political, it's cultural, it's economic, it's the social ties that we all have. I mean, my family moved here in the 50s. It can did back and forth. I was born in Italy, and then I moved here in the 90s. So for me, the kind of feel of movement concept is very much part of, of who I am. The idea that you can live, work, study, retire in any country within a broader union of independent states is something that I think we should celebrate. So from a cultural perspective, from a social perspective, but also, economically as well, we've benefited from EU nationals over the years, and the contribution that they've made to our economy, to our history and society.
Yeah, it's true about that. All of those things. I just want to pick up on one thing you were talking about there just now. And we're talking about the economics. But I cover international trade, and one of the things that's really interesting is how totemic fisheries became throughout the Brexit process, and how the EU was lambasted for the common fisheries policy. You were talking about the history of that. Of course, we all know that when the UK joined the EU, or the common market back in the 70s, fisheries were seen as expendable. That's on record. And it's been that same way. You were talking about how Scottish ministers never actively involved in the discussions. So UK ministers, really treating that as second best. And we've seen the results now as we've come out the other side of Brexit, that fisheries have pretty much been torn apart by the lack of any interest from the UK government in it. So that must be particularly galling when you're looking at these things, and we're talking quite rightly about the benefits of rejoining, but we can see the real damage that's been done by being dragged out against our will.
Absolutely, Drew, and you'll know yourself, from representing, that part of Scotland, just how much, your communities will have felt, not be able to have a direct access to the market that they've always had, the red tape that has been added on to that process. I mean, our fishing industry was literally on its knees, particularly in the early months of last year, and this is self-inflicted. So we could have so many debates about the common fisheries policy, and how it can be best reformed. I mean, looking at how our industry has been let down time and time again by successive UK governments, I think that Scotland's voice on the European stage would be better heard. We would be able to reform systems in a way that suits our needs as well, and make the case for that in a way that the UK government simply hasn't done over the past 45 years for us.
Yeah. So if all goes to plan and Scotland becomes what would be a normal state for a country, an independent country, over the next few years, how likely is it that Scotland could rejoin the EU fairly quickly? We've all heard the arguments against this, referencing things like Scotland's perceived deficit, and we could do shown that, just talking about the holes in that argument, but also things like, you know, adopting the euro, the Spanish veto, amongst all these things are thrown up as arguments. What would you say back to people saying we couldn't join the EU?
Yeah. Well, that's right. I mean, last time it was full of bogus stories, all sorts of claims about how we would be able to join the EU for all sorts of.
But I think we should also, just before you continue, I think we should also say that last time we were told in 2014, if we voted yes, we would be kicked out of the EU and we'd find that come to
Well, that's right.
pass.
That,
But anyway,
that,
sorry,
that's
anyway, right.
right. So, so actually, we're in a position, as we know, where you know, we're out of the EU against our will, despite the fact that we were told that um, the best way to secure our future was to vote no. So yes, we will continue to be presented with all these bogus claims. I mean, let's take them in turn. I mean, the deficit is not a barrier to the accession process. It has never been a barrier to the accession process. It's not the case that a country's deficit needs to be at 3% when you apply to join the EU. Countries need to implement a plan, if you like, to bring their deficit closer to 3% by the time that they join. But the real politique of the situation, if you look at what happened with Croatia, you know, their deficit was particularly quite a bit higher than 3%. And then they got themselves into a situation where they were closer to that 3% by the time.
And of course, post-pandemic, there's a lot of countries now that have a very much higher deficit than 3%. And that's not been a barrier.
Absolutely. And post-pandemic, the EU is now looking at not going back to that Stability and Growth Pact. So there's countries like Italy and France that are making the case for complete reform of those rules. Because as you say, post-pandemic, so during the pandemic, those rules were relaxed. Actually, not relaxed. They were completely taken out of context. They were completely frozen as such, because governments had to uh, borrow and do what they had to do during COVID. So those rules have not applied during COVID, and now countries are making the case that that from a growth perspective, we should be looking at a different set of rules that are not so tight. So actually, Scotland might find itself not having to comply with these rules. We'll see what happens going forward in the next few months. But certainly, it is not true that you need to have your deficit at 3% when you apply for EU membership. You need to get it closer to that by the time that you join. And these things are always governed by the realpolitik. The EU would rather have countries in the European Union, and therefore, if it has to, tweak a few things or give it some flexibility, then that would apply to Scotland too. On the point around the Spanish veto, again, I think this is, it's more scaremongering. I think, but for the Spanish government, it's always been about proving that Scotland is different to Catalonia, in the sense that the Spanish constitution prevents the Catalan government from holding a legal referendum. It wouldn't be the case in Scotland if we had the Section 30 order, and therefore it's in their interest to point to those differences. And they've said time and time again that if Scotland has a legal referendum, then Spain would not block it. Something that Catalonia would not be able to do. So, so that again is another non-issue, frankly, that has been amplified by the No campaign. And again, on the euro, there are countries like Sweden who have not joined the euro.
Romania indeed. Yep. And others.
And others. I think, we can have that debate later down the line as to what currency we want to use. It's up to us to decide what currency we want to use.
Now, a large part of the seminar that we were talking about that you held, we talked about earlier in the podcast, was dedicated to the argument about whether or not we should apply for full EU membership or EFTA membership. Could you perhaps give our listeners a bit of insight into the importance of full EU membership and why that's now the Scottish Government's policy?
Well, I think, even if you look at what's happening right now, Drew, with EU being centre stage uh, in development, trade, everyone's talking about, they're not talking about EFTA. The EU is a club that we want to be part of because that is a club that gives us the vast majority of benefits. If you're in EFTA, which is, you know, a, an option, it is an option. I don't think that it is the best option. But if you're in EFTA, you don't get access to, or rather, you don't have full representation of all of the EU's institutions. So you don't have a commissioner, you don't have directly elected MEPs, you don't have a judge on the European Court of Justice, you don't have the full civil service body that you would in Brussels. You would be rule takers, but not rule makers. You have to still apply EU legislation. So Norway had to redefine its entire gas industry based on EU regulation. And Norway is not part of the EU, it's part of EFTA. Because EFTA member states, and I think political parties, particularly in the yes movement, who make the case for EFTA, don't often say this, but countries like Norway still have to implement EU legislation, and they're not part of the EU. Now, that to me is not full independence. If we've been trying to gain full independence for our country, I want what's best for Scotland on the world stage, and I want Scotland to have the fullest possible access to decision making at the highest levels, and EFTA would not give us that. So I think for me that is a key point.
Well, just on that subject, there are some in the independence movement who would seek to have Scotland as an independent country, but also don't wish to rejoin the EU, and they often use the line, which has now been adopted by the No campaign: "Why leave one union to join another?" You've just been talking about the difficulties that Norway and and others who are interacting with the EU have when they're not aligned with the rules. They have to adopt them anyway. We've seen the struggle that the UK's had being out of the EU, with all the trying to make sure it works, and we've seen the devastation to Scotland and the rest of the UK's largest export and import market, that the EU of some 40 million people. We've seen the impact of that for a past while. So I think it's pretty clear that there are benefits being in there. What would you say to that question, though? Just to further expand, why leave one union to join another?
I must say I've never fully understood that question in the sense that comparison, rather, in the sense that the UK is a state, the European Union is a club of independent member states, and that is the difference. That if you are in a club of independent countries, you're able to come together to coalesce and make a difference. And if we're seeing what the EU is doing right now, or the action that it took on Ukraine, the very decisive action, I think that shows what the EU is actually capable of doing when it gets its act together, when it is united on too many issues, like the migrant crisis, the Eurozone crisis. When the EU historically is faced with a new crisis, it doesn't always do very well, but it very quickly learns from those crises, and it is then able to respond better in the future. But what we're seeing right now is a European Union that is united and effective on sanctions against Russia, and we're really seeing the power of the European Union functioning effectively right now, and it has taken a lead well before the US and well before the UK, and so that is really what I want to see Scotland be part of.
It's a striking example, isn't it, just now with the refugee crisis in Ukraine, how quickly the EU member states all agreed on a set of principles to suspend their immigration policies for 3 years to allow people to get refuge, and how difficult and obstructive we've seen things happen in the UK here. It's a lot of it's because of the hostile environment, but also because another part of it is because of the sheer chaos of the UK Home Office. But I think that example of the EU being able to very quickly, all these independent nation states, being very quickly able to come together and agree a common set of rules that affect people and give people safe place is a real example of the power of being, one of the members with a seat at the table of the EU and being able to work collaboratively.
Absolutely. And, you know, the other thing that I would say really is that, the difference between a, a voluntary European Union and the UK is that, Brexit was able to happen. Right now, the UK is denying us the right to have an independence referendum for our mandates to be implemented. That's not a union of equals. The European Union is a union of equals that allowed the UK. Well, of course, the UK is an independent country, and therefore, it was always going to be able to have that referendum. We're in a different situation. So that's really what I would say to people is there's a difference between a state whereby Scotland is not an equal player and a club of independent countries that pool their sovereignty for the greater good. And actually, that to me is the greatest example of being an independent country is the opportunity to have that say and to be in that room with other countries represented.
And of course, Scotland is at its core an international country. It's a country that's always had international lookout. Its entire history for over 1,000 years has been based on cooperation and working with nations throughout Europe and beyond. We've seen Scotland's soft power increasing exponentially in the past few years. The most obvious example, I think, is when the First Minister was meeting leaders from around the world at COP26, and despite the best efforts of Boris Johnson's government to keep her out of the picture, we saw these international leaders crossing the room to come and speak to her. Could being an EU member state enhance that soft power even further? And what sort of EU member do you believe that Scotland would become?
I think Scotland, as a small EU member state, would have a lot of influence. Actually, as I said earlier, small EU countries have had some of the most successful EU presidencies. I think that we could lead on areas of expertise like climate change and what we're doing with our, climate change legislation, life sciences, fisheries. There's a lot of areas where we have expertise in Scotland where we could be leading the way in Europe. And I think that having that distinct voice would allow us to do that. And I think that I would like to see our discourse on EU membership change slightly from the whole, you know, firefighting, around, the border or the euro and the deficit to actually presenting what kind of member state Scotland would be. What would our view be on, uh, you know, um, migration, for example, or asylum or a European asylum policy? What would our view be on an energy policy for the whole of the European Union? I would like our politics to take a bit more of an international shift, and start acting almost like we were already an independent country in Europe. So that's what I hope for the next, few months as we go into hopefully an independence referendum in the future, that we start thinking about uh, policies at a more regional level, at a European regional level, and think about what contribution we would make to Europe as an independent country.
Do you think that going through you talked about Scotland being dragged out of the EU against its will earlier? Do you think going through the Brexit debacle, I'll call it that because I've seen it unfolding at Westminster, and that it's been just a complete and utter mess based on an ideology that had no foundation in any benefits for people living either here or indeed in the other nations of the UK? Do you think being forced to go through the Brexit process has really changed minds and attitudes over Scottish independence and the EU over the past few years?
In terms of in terms of whether people are more likely to want to be part of the EU.
Yep.
Uh,
Yeah, I think that's a key thing. We've seen polls. Obviously, Scotland voted 62% to remain, a pretty overwhelming
Sure.
result. All 32 local authorities when the vote was held. But in the years that have passed since Brexit, what's your feeling about whether or not that's changed the view of
Well,
people about the benefits of the EU?
I think that on the whole, we're seeing UK ministers constantly trying to prove that Brexit was a success, and they have nothing to show. Th- There is no Brexit dividend. I'm still waiting for this Brexit dividend. I mean, we're
If it's any consolation, they've put Jacob Rees-Mogg in charge of finding that Brexit dividend, and so far
well,
I think he's come up empty. He's come up with one complete untruth about the European Medicines Agency and whether or not it would have blocked vaccines. Apart from that,
yeah,
they've come up with
yeah.
absolutely nothing.
Well, I mean, we've seen just this week, haven't we, that that UK exports have seriously underperformed in the post-lockdown trade bounce. Well, we've seen quite a few advanced economies um, making quite a strong recovery in trade, whereas UK exports, I think, are actually at pre-pandemic levels. So, what we're seeing now is, the UK's own finance body, the OBR, saying that in the long term, it is Brexit that will have a bigger impact on our economy than the pandemic. I think the pandemic has almost to an extent masked the initial impact of Brexit. But the reality is that Brexit is costing us every single day. It's costing our businesses. The red tape is costing our businesses right across the country. Uh, and the Brexit dividend that we were promised was a lie. There is no Brexit dividend. There is no more money for the NHS. We're seeing structural funds, and the Highlands have benefited hugely over the years over structural funds. Um, the UK equivalent is considerably smaller in
The
budget.
levelling up fund is tiny
Yeah,
in comparison to the EU funding that came to the islands.
absolutely. So I mean, they're forever trying to. We were told, we were the fastest growing economy in the G7, which wasn't the case. We were told that, thanks to Brexit, we had the most successful vaccine rollout in Europe. Actually, Portugal and other countries got there in the long run, fast. So, they're forever trying to find something, anything, anything at all.
Blue passports.
Nothing.
Blue passports, I think, is the
Yes, but blue passports is what we're left with. And actually, while we get blue passports, our young people aren't able to benefit from the likes of Erasmus,
yeah.
um, exchanges, those cultural exchanges that made us all stronger, that helped us understand each other's cultures and languages. And I think that's really sad. I think it's hugely sad that the opportunities that I have, we won't be able to pass this on, at least for now, to to future generations. And that's why I think we need to take, to give Scotland the chance, the opportunity to have an independence referendum, and to get back to a European Union that can help us thrive as a country.
You talked there about the deliberate harm that's been inflicted on Scotland's trade, for example. One of the things that people don't often appreciate is that filters right through to the cost of living crisis at the moment. Speaking to people who are involved in distribution and import of sometimes component parts for products that they produce here and whatever, I'm being told every day about the costs that are increasing for them that are now being passed on to consumers. We're now seeing inflation at record levels that we haven't seen for decades and decades. In fact, I think we're in the worst economic state since the Second World War in terms of what's happening just now. So those things are having real effects on people, and it's really important to understand that whilst yes, there are global things going on, the war in Ukraine has an effect on the economy. Other things have an effect on the economy as well. That Brexit has a direct impact on what's happening. And of course, as you said earlier, we can make a big difference by rejoining the EU and being an independent country that makes decisions for itself. Might make some mistakes for itself.
Sure.
Nothing's going to be
We
simple.
will.
No
Yeah.
country ever has it completely right and gets it completely right, but at least you'll be making decisions for your own. Talking about your own view on independence, if you could implement one policy or change a current policy that we can't do because we're not independent at the moment, what would that be?
Oh gosh, which one can I choose? I mean, I would say just because of what's happening right now, I would say probably immigration and asylum. It's just not working for us at all. I mean, in terms of the UK government's response to Ukraine, we are so obsessed with this hostile environment policy that actually drove Brexit because the vast majority of people who voted for it on those grounds on immigration. I think that we will have the opportunity to create an immigration and asylum system that works for us. We need to expand our tax base in Scotland. We have a completely different set of demographics and needs, and actually that would allow us to, from a humanitarian perspective, ensure that 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 we can respond effectively when we need to situations like Ukraine or Syria, but actually economically ensure that we are able to build an economy that works for Scotland. And as I say, expand that tax base from other parts of the EU, other parts of the UK. And I think that Scotland could be a very attractive place to live and work, if only we had the powers at our disposal, and to rid ourselves of that really nasty politics, otherwise known as a hostile environment.
Well, I think that's quite a good place for us to end our discussion today. Toni, Giugliano, thank you very much for joining us on Scotland's Choice.
Thank you, Drew.